May 27, 1942. 03:47 hours. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, Station HYPO. Commander Joseph Rochefort hadn't slept in 36 hours. His red smoking jacket hung loose over rumpled khakis. Bedroom slippers scuffed against the concrete floor as he paced between banks of humming IBM tabulating machines. The basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and the particular metallic tang of men working themselves toward collapse. Around him, 42 cryptanalysts hunched over desks covered in Japanese intercepts, their pencils scratching against paper in a desperate race against time. The air was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the tropical heat seeping through the walls. These men knew something that almost no one else in the United States Navy understood. They knew where the Japanese were going to strike next. Taken air when they knew with what forces. The problem was proving it. Rochefort stopped beside the desk of Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, his chief analyst, and stared at the latest decrypt. The message, pulled from the ether by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific, had been partially decoded using fragments of the Japanese Navy's JN-25 operational code. Like most intercepts, it was incomplete, riddled with gaps, where code groups remained unbroken. But the fragments that had yielded to HYPO's relentless assault told a story that made Rochefort's blood run cold. The message referenced AF. It referenced a date in early June. It referenced a massive naval force including 4 fleet carriers, the heart of Japanese striking power in the Pacific. Rochefort was certain he knew what AF meant. He was certain it meant Midway, the Tainai Atoll, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, that represented America's westernmost outpost in the Central Pacific. He was certain the Japanese were coming with everything they had. Washington disagreed. 6,000 miles away, in the Navy Department's Communications Intelligence Section, analysts had reached a different conclusion. They believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands, far to the north. They believed the main Japanese thrust would come against Alaska, with Midway as a diversion. They had the ear of Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, the most powerful officer in the United States Navy. Rochefort had the ear of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. But Nimitz was being pressured from above to deploy his precious carriers northward, toward a threat that Rochefort knew did not exist. The fate of the Pacific War hung on which basement full of exhausted codebreakers was right. What followed over the next 2 weeks would become the most consequential intelligence operation in American naval history. It would involve deception, desperation, and a gamble so audacious that it still astonishes historians 8 decades later. It would prove that in modern warfare, the ability to know what your enemy is planning matters more than the size of your fleet. And it would transform a nation reeling from 6 months of unbroken defeat into the dominant naval power in the Pacific. The story of Midway begins not in the waters of the Central Pacific, but in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, in the smoking ruins of American complacency. On December 7, 1941, Japan had achieved the most successful surprise attack in naval history. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans killed. The Pacific Fleet, pride of the United States Navy, had been crippled in less than 2 hours. But the Japanese had made a crucial error. They had attacked the fleet, but ignored the infrastructure. The fuel tank farms at Pearl Harbor, containing 4.5 million barrels of oil, remained untouched. The repair facilities survived intact. The submarine base was undamaged, and Station HYPO, the Navy's Pacific Cryptanalysis Center, continued operating without interruption. Commander Rochefort had arrived at HYPO in June 1941, 6 months before the attack. A veteran cryptanalyst who had learned Japanese during a 3-year posting in Tokyo, Rochefort understood both the language and the culture of America's future enemy. He had spent the interwar years studying Japanese naval communications, building the expertise that would prove essential when war came. HYPO occupied the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, a windowless space that Rochefort had deliberately chosen for its isolation. He wanted his analysts focused entirely on their work, undistracted by the outside world. The basement became their universe, a realm of intercepts and code groups, and the endless, grinding labor of cryptanalysis, the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, designated HOTA NA-25 by American intelligence. was a complex cipher system that used 5-digit code groups modified by additive tables. Breaking it required not just mathematical skill but an intimate understanding of Japanese naval terminology, procedures, and thinking patterns. It required patience measured in months and years, not days and weeks. By December 1941, HYPO and its sister stations had penetrated perhaps 10% of JN25. Enough to catch glimpses of Japanese planning, but not enough to provide actionable intelligence. The attack on Pearl Harbor had come as a complete surprise. A failure that haunted Rochefort and drove his team to work even harder in the months that followed. Through the dark winter of 1942, as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific, HYPO's analysts labored in their basement, slowly increasing their penetration of the Japanese code. They worked in shifts around the clock, sleeping on cots pushed against the walls, eating sandwiches brought down from the cafeteria, rarely seeing sunlight. Rochefort himself often worked 20-hour days, his red smoking jacket becoming a symbol of his eccentric dedication. By April 1942, HYPO was reading approximately 15% of intercepted JN25 messages. It wasn't much, but it was enough to detect patterns. It was enough to notice that Japanese communications were increasingly referencing an operation, codenamed me. It was enough to deduce that something big was coming. The first solid intelligence about Japanese intentions came in mid-April, when HYPO intercepted messages discussing the assembly of a massive fleet. The messages referenced multiple carrier divisions, battleship squadrons, invasion transports. Whatever operation me represented, it was going to be the largest Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor. The question was where. The intercepts consistently referenced a target designated AEF, but the Japanese, aware that their communications might be intercepted, never explicitly stated what AF represented. The designation could refer to any of a dozen potential targets across the Pacific. American planners debated endlessly, their arguments growing more heated as the date of the Japanese operation approached. Rochefort was convinced that AF meant Midway. The atoll made strategic sense as a target. Its capture would extend Japanese defensive perimeter eastward, threaten Hawaii, and potentially draw the American fleet into a decisive battle. The fragmentary intelligence HYPO had gathered pointed consistently toward the Central Pacific, but Washington's analysts saw the same intercepts and reached different conclusions. They noted Japanese activity in the North Pacific, references to operations in the Aleutians, indicators that suggested Alaska might be the primary target. They argued that the Japanese were using AF as a deception, trying to draw American attention toward Midway, while the real attack came elsewhere. The debate might have continued indefinitely, with potentially catastrophic consequences. If not for a deception operation that remains one of the most elegant intelligence gambits in military history. On May 19, 1942, with the approval of Admiral Nimitz, Rochefort arranged for the American garrison on Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting that the Island S desalination plant had broken down and fresh water was running short. The message was deliberately transmitted in a low-grade cipher that HYPO knew the Japanese could read. 2 days later, HYPO intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was experiencing water problems. The trap had worked. F was Midway. There was no longer any room for doubt. Rochefort immediately informed Nimitz, who made one of the most consequential command decisions of the Pacific War. Ignoring pressure from Washington to deploy his carriers northward, Nimitz ordered the Pacific Fleet to concentrate near Midway. He would meet the Japanese with everything he had. Everything, in May 1942, wasn't much. The Pacific Fleet possessed only 3 operational fleet carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese were bringing 4 carriers, plus an overwhelming superiority in battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On paper, the battle should have been a catastrophic American defeat. But Nimitz had something the Japanese didn't know he had. He had intelligence. By late May, HYPO had pieced together a remarkably complete picture of Japanese plans. They knew the date of the attack, June 4th or 5th. They knew the composition of the attacking force. 4 fleet carriers under Admiral Kichin, supported by battleships and cruisers, with a separate invasion force carrying 5,000 troops. They knew the approach route. From the northwest, with the carriers positioned to launch strikes at dawn. They even knew the names of the Japanese carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same 4 ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. This intelligence transformed an impossible tactical situation into a difficult but manageable one. Instead of searching blindly across thousands of square miles of ocean, American carriers could position themselves in advance, waiting in ambush. Instead of reacting to Japanese moves, they could anticipate them. The value of this foreknowledge cannot be overstated. In naval warfare, finding the enemy is often harder than fighting him. The Pacific Ocean covers 63 million square miles. A carrier task force, moving at 25 knots, can cover 600 miles in a day. Without intelligence, searching for enemy ships becomes a lottery with deadly stakes. With HYPO's intelligence, Nimitz knew almost exactly where to look. But intelligence alone could not win the battle. The Pacific Fleet still had to reach Midway with enough strength to fight. And here, the unsung heroes of American logistics performed a miracle that rivaled HYPO's codebreaking achievement. On May 27, 1942, the aircraft carrier Yorktown limped into Pearl Harbor trailing an oil slick visible 4 miles. 3 weeks earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she had taken a 550-pound bomb through her flight deck. The explosion had killed 66 men, started fires that burned for hours, and buckled structural frames deep in the ship's hull. The damage was severe enough that initial estimates called for 3 months of yard work. The Yorktown would miss the coming battle entirely. Admiral Nimitz had other ideas. Within hours of Yorktown's arrival, the carrier was moved into Dry Dock No. 1 at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. What happened over the next 72 hours would become legendary in the annals of naval repair. Captain Clarence Aldrich, the Navy Yard commander, assembled every available worker. Welders, electricians, ship fitters, carpenters, and machinists swarmed over the wounded carrier in shifts that ran around the clock. The normal protocols of peacetime repair work were abandoned. Men worked until they collapsed, grabbed a few hours of sleep, and returned to work. The scale of the effort defied comprehension. At peak intensity, over 1,400 workers were simultaneously laboring on the ship. They welded steel plates over bomb damage, replaced shattered frames, reconnected severed electrical cables, and repaired aviation fuel lines that had come within feet of catastrophic rupture. They worked by the light of portable generators, in spaces still reeking of smoke and death. The repair crews faced challenges that would have seemed insurmountable under normal circumstances. The bomb that had struck Yorktown had detonated 4 decks deep, buckling structural members that formed the ship's skeleton. Proper repair would require cutting away the damaged sections and fabricating new ones, a process that normally took weeks. Instead, the repair teams devised expedient solutions. They cut and welded with extraordinary speed, accepting imperfect fixes that would hold long enough for battle. They jurigged systems that couldn't be properly repaired, bypassing damaged components with temporary connections. They made the ship functional rather than perfect, seaworthy rather than pristine. Rear Admiral Chester McCarty, commanding officer of Yorktown, watched the repair effort with amazement and gratitude. The men worked themselves to exhaustion without complaint, he later wrote. They understood what was at stake. Every welder knew that his work might mean the difference between victory and defeat. The logistics extended far beyond Yorktown's repairs. In those same critical days, supply offices across the Pacific worked frantically to ensure the American fleet would have everything it needed for battle. Aviation fuel had to be transported from storage facilities to the carriers. Each carrier required approximately 400,000 gallons of aviation gasoline for full operations. The 3 American carriers collectively needed over 1 million gallons, plus reserves for extended operations. Ammunition had to be loaded. Each carrier air group required thousands of bombs, torpedoes, and machine gun rounds. The ordnance had to be transported from magazines, hoisted aboard ships, and distributed to ready storage locations throughout the vessels. Aircraft had to be prepared. The 3 carriers would embark 233 aircraft between them, each requiring inspection, maintenance, and arming. Spare parts had to be loaded, toolkits checked, flight crews briefed. Food, medical supplies, spare equipment for damage control, fuel for escorts, water for crews in tropical heat. All of it had to be assembled, transported, loaded, and secured in less than a week. Commander Raymond Tarbuck, the supply officer responsible for coordinating much of this effort, later described it as controlled chaos. Everyone knew the schedule was impossible. Everyone worked to meet it anyway. The normal paperwork was abandoned. Requisitions were approved by shouted conversations. Trucks arrived and departed in endless streams. The effort succeeded because American industrial capacity, even in the dark days of early 1942, could still produce miracles when properly motivated. The ships that sorted from Pearl Harbor on May 28th and 29th were fully supplied, fully armed, and ready for battle. Yorktown sailed on May 30th, just 72 hours after arriving for what had been estimated as 3 months of repairs. She wasn't fully restored, but she was ready to fight. Her air group was intact, her weapons functional, her engines capable of fleet speed. The shipyard workers who had labored around the clock stood on the docks and cheered as she passed, many of them still wearing the stained coveralls. They hadn't had time to change. The Japanese, meanwhile, sailed toward Midway, confident of victory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had planned the operation meticulously. He was bringing overwhelming force. 4 fleet carriers with 248 aircraft, 7 battleships including the monster Yamato with her 18-inch guns, 15 cruisers, 44 destroyers, and supporting vessels beyond counting. Against this armada, the Americans could deploy 3 carriers with 233 aircraft, no battleships, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. By any conventional calculation, the battle should have been a Japanese triumph. But Yamamoto didn't know that his plans had been compromised. He didn't know that American cryptanalysts had read his operational orders. He didn't know that the American fleet would be waiting in ambush, positioned to strike before his carriers could locate them. The Japanese approach to Midway reflected their confidence. Rather than concentrating their forces, they dispersed them across multiple objectives. A northern force would attack the Aleutians as a diversion. The main body with the battleships would trail the carrier force by hundreds of miles, too far to provide immediate support. The operation was designed for a scenario in which the Americans reacted to Japanese moves rather than anticipating them. This dispersal would prove fatal. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Admiral Nagimo's carrier force approached Midway from the northwest, exactly as HYPO had predicted. At 4:30 a.m., the Japanese launched their first strike against the atoll. 108 aircraft that would bomb and strafe the American installations, while Nagumo's remaining planes prepared to deal with any American ships that might appear. What Nagumo didn't know was that American carriers were already positioned 200 miles to the northeast, their aircraft armed and ready to launch. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force from Yorktown, set HYPO's intelligence to achieve something unprecedented in Pacific warfare. Complete tactical surprise against a superior force. The battle that followed was chaotic, bloody, and decided by margins so thin they still seem miraculous. American torpedo bomber attacks, launched with extraordinary courage against overwhelming fighter opposition, were slaughtered almost to the last plane. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 survived. They scored no hits, but the torpedo bombers did something that proved more valuable than direct damage. They drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers unprotected against the dive bombers that arrived minutes later. At 10:22 a.m., 37 American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown pushed over into their attacks. In less than 5 minutes, they transformed the Pacific War. Bombs struck Akagi, igniting aviation fuel and armed aircraft on her hangar deck. Bombs struck Kaga, detonating among planes being refueled and rearmed. Bombs struck Soryu, turning her into a floating inferno. 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, the veteran ships of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, were mortally wounded in 300 seconds. Hiryu, the surviving Japanese carrier, launched a counterstrike that found Yorktown. 2 waves of Japanese aircraft scored 3 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits, inflicting damage that would eventually sink the American carrier. But Hiryu's survival was brief. That afternoon, American dive bombers found her and added a 4th funeral pyre to the Pacific horizon. By nightfall on June 4th, The Battle of Midway was effectively over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including many of her most experienced pilots. America had lost 1 carrier, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. The Japanese would never again possess the carrier strength to undertake major offensive operations. The Americans, their industrial capacity now fully mobilizing, would build 17 fleet carriers and 65 escort carriers before the war ended. The tide had turned. In the aftermath of the battle, the American intelligence community carefully concealed the role of codebreaking in the victory. The official narrative emphasized American courage and Japanese mistakes, both of which were real enough. But the decisive advantage, the foreknowledge that had allowed 3 American carriers to ambush for Japanese carriers, remained secret. This secrecy was essential because the war was far from over. JN-25 continued to provide valuable intelligence throughout 1942 and 1943, guiding American operations and revealing Japanese plans. Any hint that the code had been compromised would have prompted the Japanese to change their cipher systems, potentially blinding American intelligence at a critical moment. Commander Rochefort received no public recognition for his contribution to victory. Indeed, in one of the more disgraceful episodes of inter-service rivalry, OP-20G, in Washington worked to undermine Rochefort's reputation, resentful that his analyses had been proven correct while theirs had been wrong. Rochefort was transferred away from HYPO in October 1942. His intelligence career effectively ended by bureaucratic revenge. He spent the rest of the war commanding a floating dry dock in San Francisco. His expertise wasted while lesser men received credit for his achievements. He retired in 1953 and died in 1976. Still largely unknown to the public, he had helped save. The Navy finally awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, 10 years after his death. The citation recognized his contributions to the victory at Midway, acknowledging at last what insiders had known for 4 decades. The codebreakers of Station HYPO, working in their basement with their tabulating machines and their pencils, had changed the course of history. The logistics miracle at Pearl Harbor Navy Yard received similarly delayed recognition. The workers who had repaired Yorktown in 72 hours were not soldiers, and their contribution did not fit the narrative of combat heroism that dominates war stories. But without their efforts, Yorktown would not have been at Midway, and without Yorktown's aircraft, the American strike might not have been strong enough to cripple the Japanese force. The 2 miracles, intelligence and logistics, were inseparable. Rochefort's codebreaking told Nimitz where and when the Japanese would attack. The Navy Yard's repair crews gave him the ships to meet them. Together, they transformed an impossible situation into a decisive victory. In attempting to seize the island, the Japanese committed their main strength to an operation where we were able to concentrate our defenses with foreknowledge of the target. The German Naval attached in Tokyo, observing the aftermath of Midway from the perspective of Japan's ally, drew similar conclusions. The attache recommended that Germany review its own code security, advice that Berlin largely ignored with consequences that would become apparent in the Atlantic. The broader lessons of Midway extended far beyond the specific circumstances of the battle. The victory demonstrated that in modern warfare information could be more valuable than ships, that knowing your enemy's plans could compensate for numerical inferiority, that intelligence was not merely an adjunct to combat power but a form of combat power itself. These lessons would shape American military doctrine for generations. The investment in signals intelligence that began during World War II continued and expanded during the Cold War, eventually producing the vast surveillance capabilities that characterize American intelligence today. It validated the American approach to industrial warfare, The emphasis on production capacity, standardized parts, and pragmatic engineering that would prove decisive not just at Midway but across every theater of the war. The Japanese, for their part, learned the wrong lessons from Midway. They attributed their defeat to bad luck, to the chance timing of the American dive bomber attacks, to failures of individual commanders. They did not recognize the intelligence dimension of their defeat, did not understand that their operational codes had been compromised, did not change the procedures that continued to betray their plans to American analysts. This failure to learn allowed American intelligence to continue exploiting Japanese communications throughout the war. The shooting down of Admiral Yamamoto in April 19, when American fighters intercepted his transport aircraft based on decoded travel plans, demonstrated how completely the intelligence advantage had shifted. The Japanese suspected but never confirmed that their codes were broken, a failure of imagination that cost them dearly. Admiral Yamamoto himself had worried about the security of Japanese communications before Midway. In the weeks before the battle, he had urged his staff to consider whether the Americans might have penetrated their codes. The human cost of Midway fell disproportionately on the young men who flew the aircraft that decided the battle. The American torpedo bomber crews who attacked the Japanese carriers in the morning of June 4th knew they were flying into almost certain death. The Devastator torpedo bombers they flew were slow, poorly armed, and hopelessly outclassed by Japanese fighters. The torpedoes they carried were unreliable, often failing to detonate even when they hit their targets. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked first, 15 aircraft flying directly into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol. Not one survived. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Only one crew member, Ensign George Gay, lived to be rescued. He spent the rest of the battle floating in the water, watching the Japanese carriers burn. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown fared little better. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, 6 returned. They scored no hits. The sacrifice seemed pointless, a tragic waste of brave men on a futile mission. But those torpedo bomber crews had done something that the history books sometimes overlook. By attacking at low level, they had forced the Japanese combat air patrol to descend to intercept them. When the American dive bombers arrived minutes later, coming in high from the sun, there were no fighters at altitude to meet them. The dive bombers achieved surprise because the torpedo bombers had paid for it with their lives. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led Torpedo Squadron 8 to its destruction, had told his men before the battle that he expected most of them would not return. He asked only that they press home their attacks, regardless of opposition, that they give the dive bombers a chance to succeed. His squadron did exactly that, and every one of them died doing it. This is the part of Midway that intelligence and logistics cannot explain. The Codebreakers told Nimitz where the Japanese would be. The shipyard workers gave him the carriers to meet them, but the men who actually decided the battle, who climbed into their aircraft, knowing the odds, who flew into walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of enemy fighters, made choices that no analysis could predict and no production line could manufacture. The victory at Midway belonged to all of them. To Rochefort and his cryptanalysts, in their basement, working themselves to exhaustion over fragments of Japanese code, to the welders and electricians who repaired Yorktown in 72 hours, accepting imperfect solutions, because perfect solutions would take too long, to the pilots who pressed home attacks against impossible odds, trading their lives for seconds of distraction that changed history. In the decades after the war, as the intelligence dimension of Midway slowly became public knowledge, historians debated how much credit to assign to HYPO's codebreaking. Some argued that the intelligence advantage was decisive, that without foreknowledge of Japanese plans, the battle would certainly have been lost. Others contended that American courage and Japanese mistakes would have produced victory regardless, that the intelligence merely made an inherent American advantage more certain. The debate misses the point. Victory at Midway required everything: intelligence and logistics and courage and luck. Remove any element, and the outcome becomes uncertain. The Codebreakers needed the ships. The ships needed the workers who repaired them. The workers needed the pilots who would fly into battle. The pilots needed the intelligence that told them where to find the enemy. Modern military doctrine calls this combined arms warfare, the integration of different capabilities into a whole greater than the sum of its parts. At Midway, America achieved combined arms warfare on a scale and with a sophistication that Japan could not match. Not because American sailors were braver or American ships were better, but because American systems worked together in ways that Japanese systems did not. The Japanese approach to Midway reflected their cultural emphasis on warrior spirit, on the decisive battle won by superior fighting men through courage and skill. They dispersed their forces because they were confident in the quality of each component. They sailed without reconnaissance because they believed surprise was on their side. They attacked without understanding their enemy because they trusted in the inherent superiority of Japanese arms. The American approach reflected a different cultural tradition, one that valued preparation, information, and systematic organization. Nimitz concentrated his forces because he knew where the battle would be fought. He positioned his carriers based on intelligence rather than intuition. He trusted in the work of men he would never meet, cryptanalysts in basements and workers in shipyards, to give his fighting men a chance. This difference, cultural as much as military, would characterize the entire Pacific War. Japan fought with courage and skill, often superior to their American opponents in individual engagements. America fought with systems and production, grinding advantages that accumulated over time until they became overwhelming. By 1945, America would deploy more aircraft carriers than all other nations combined had built in the history of naval aviation. The industrial capacity that had repaired Yorktown in 72 hours would produce entire fleets in the time Japan needed to train a single air group. The intelligence capabilities that had revealed Japanese plans at Midway would continue to provide advantages throughout the war. Midway was the moment when these American strengths first converged into decisive victory. It was the proof of concept for American warfare, the demonstration that information and production could defeat courage and tradition. Everything that followed, the island-hopping campaign, the submarine war against Japanese shipping, the strategic bombing that devastated Japanese cities, built on foundations laid in the first week of June 1942. Commander Rochefort, working in his basement in the months before Midway, could not have known how completely his analysis would be vindicated. He believed he was right about AF. He believed the Japanese were coming to Midway. He staked his professional reputation on that belief, arguing against Washington analysts who outranked him and had better political connections. The water ruse that confirmed AF's identity as Midway was an act of intellectual courage as much as analytical brilliance. Rochefort asked Nimitz to risk revealing American intelligence capabilities on the chance that his analysis was correct. If he had been wrong, if AF had referred to something other than Midway, the deception would have accomplished nothing while potentially alerting the Japanese that their codes were compromised. But Rochefort was right, and his willingness to test his analysis saved the Pacific Fleet. Captain Joseph Finnegan, one of Rochefort's analysts at HYPO, later reflected on the atmosphere in the basement during those critical days. "We knew how much depended on our work," Finnegan recalled. "We knew that if we were wrong, men would die because of our mistakes. The pressure was enormous, but it also focused us. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. We had to be right." They were right. And because they were right, because welders worked through the night to repair a damaged carrier, because pilots flew into certain death to give their comrades a chance, because 1,000 acts of courage and competence came together in a single week, the Pacific War turned. 70 years later, the lessons of Midway remain relevant. In an age of satellites and cyber warfare, of artificial intelligence and global surveillance, the fundamental principle holds. Knowing your enemy's intentions provides advantages that no amount of material superiority can match. The cryptanalysts of Station HYPO, working with pencils and tabulating machines, demonstrated truths that the National Security Agency applies today with supercomputers and algorithms. And the logistics lesson endures as well. The ability to repair, resupply, and sustain military forces determines what those forces can accomplish. The shipyard workers who repaired Yorktown were not warriors in any traditional sense, but their contribution to victory was as real as any pilot's. The unseen army of mechanics, clerks, cooks, and cargo handlers who kept the Pacific Fleet operational made possible everything the combat forces achieved. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded the Pacific Fleet's carrier forces in the later stages of the war, understood this truth implicitly. He once told a group of supply officers, "You people don't get the glory, but you make the glory possible. Without you, we're just a bunch of guys in ships that do you and sail and planes that do you and fly. Everything we do starts with what you provide." This integration of combat power and support capability, of fighting men and the systems that sustain them, represents America's distinctive contribution to modern warfare. It reflects a society that values organization and production, that trusts in systems rather than individuals, that builds institutions capable of generating sustained effort over time. The Japanese at Midway possessed all the individual virtues that military tradition celebrates. Their pilots were superbly trained, their ships excellently designed, their commanders experienced and aggressive. In a different kind of war, these qualities might have been decisive, but they were fighting a different kind of enemy, one that had spent the months before battle breaking their codes and building ships, analyzing their plans and stockpiling supplies. By the time Japanese carriers reached Midway, the battle was already half decided by men who would never fire a shot. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Leyden, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, served as the crucial link between Rochefort's analysts and Nimitz's operational planning. Leyden had known Yamamoto personally, had studied in Japan during the 1930s, and understood Japanese naval culture with an intimacy rare among American officers. In the days before Midway, Leyden presented Nimitz with intelligence assessments of remarkable precision. He predicted the Japanese approach route accurately. He estimated the timing of Japanese attacks within hours of their actual occurrence. He provided Nimitz with the information needed to position American forces for maximum advantage. On the morning of June 4th, Nimitz asked Leyden when he expected the Japanese to be sighted. Leyden consulted his notes and replied, "About 0600 this morning, at approximately 175 miles northwest of Midway. The first Japanese aircraft were sighted at 0545, at 180 miles northwest of Midway." This precision was not magic. It was a product of months of analytical work, of Rochefort's team breaking code groups one by one, of Leyden synthesizing fragmentary intelligence into coherent operational pictures. It represented institutional capability accumulated over years and applied at the decisive moment. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their intelligence services were fragmented, poorly coordinated, and oriented toward human intelligence rather than signals analysis. They did not believe the Americans could break their codes because they could not imagine the systematic effort required to do so. This failure of imagination doomed them at Midway and continued to handicap their operations throughout the war. They were fighting a nation that had institutionalized intelligence analysis, that had built organizations dedicated to understanding enemy communications, that had invested in the boring, unglamorous work of signals collection and cryptanalysis. The unsexy work won the battle. The men in the basement, not the men in the cockpits, determined where the battle would be fought and on what terms. The welders and electricians, not the admirals and captains, determined whether America would have won carrier at Midway or 3. This is the story that military historians sometimes overlook. The story of how battles are won before they are fought. How victory is manufactured in basements and shipyards before it is claimed on battlefields. Midway was a triumph of American arms, certainly, but it was also a triumph of American systems, American institutions, American ways of organizing human effort. Toward collective goals. Commander Joseph Rochefort never received the recognition he deserved during his lifetime. The bureaucratic enemies he made by being right about Midway, when Washington had been wrong, pursued him with petty vindictiveness that ended his intelligence career. He spent his final years in obscurity, his contributions known only to a handful of insiders who understood what HYPO had accomplished. But history has rendered its verdict. The Battle of Midway turned on intelligence, and the intelligence came from Rochefort's team. Without their work, Nimitz would have been blind, American carriers would have been out of position, and the battle might well have ended in Japanese victory. The men who repaired Yorktown received even less recognition. They were civilians, most of them Union workers and Navy Yard employees who answered the call when their country needed them. They worked themselves to exhaustion for a ship that would be sunk anyway, for a battle whose outcome they would learn about only later, for a cause larger than themselves. Their names are mostly forgotten. No monuments commemorate their 72-hour miracle. But without them, Without their willing sacrifice of sleep and comfort and normal life, Yorktown would not have sailed, and Midway might have been a defeat instead of a victory. The Battle of Midway demonstrates that modern warfare is won by nations, not just by armed forces. It is won by cryptanalysts and shipyard workers, by intelligence officers and supply sergeants, by all the unglamorous people who make it possible for fighting men to fight. The courage of combat pilots is magnificent, and we properly celebrate it. But courage without intelligence is blind, and courage without logistics is impotent. America won at Midway because it brought all three together. Intelligence told commanders where to fight. Logistics gave them the means to fight. Courage carried them through the fighting itself. The Japanese, for all their warrior traditions and fighting spirit, could not match this combination. They had courage in abundance, individual courage that no American commander would have disparaged, but they lacked the intelligence that would have warned them of the American ambush, and they lacked the logistical depth that would have allowed them to recover from their losses. 4 Japanese carriers sank at Midway. America would build more than 20 fleet carriers before the war ended. That disparity tells the story of the Pacific War, the story of a nation that could absorb losses and keep fighting, that could learn from mistakes and improve, that could generate military power on a scale that made individual battles less decisive than cumulative capacity. Midway was the last battle where Japan had a realistic chance of achieving strategic victory. After Midway, the war became a grinding, attritional struggle that Japan was certain to lose. American production capacity, American logistical systems, American intelligence capabilities, all the factors that had contributed to victory at Midway continued to operate throughout the war, growing stronger while Japanese capabilities weakened. By August 1945, when atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, America had demonstrated a new dimension of military power that made everything before seem primitive. But the principles remained the same. Know your enemy. Sustain your forces. Fight smart rather than just hard. Commander Rochefort understood these principles intuitively, working in his basement with his red smoking jacket and his bedroom slippers, surrounded by exhausted analysts and humming tabulating machines. He was practicing a form of warfare that his Japanese counterparts did not recognize as warfare at all. They thought wars were won by brave men with sharp swords. He knew wars were won by smart men with good information. History proved him right on the morning of June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers found Japanese carriers exactly where Rochefort said they would be, and changed the course of the Pacific War. The thunder of explosions, the roar of burning ships, the screams of dying men. These sounds fill the traditional accounts of Midway, and properly so. But beneath those sounds, inaudible, but decisive, was the scratch of pencils on paper in a Pearl Harbor basement, the spark of welding torches in a Navy Yard dry dock, the hum of machines compiling fragments of intercepted code. These quiet sounds won the battle. They won it before the first bomb fell, before the first plane launched, before the Japanese fleet even left harbor. By the time Nagumo's carriers reached Midway, they were sailing into a trap set by men they would never see and maintained by workers they would never know. The Battle of Midway was a victory of intelligence and logistics, achieved by men who never heard a shot fired in anger. It was a victory of systems over courage, of preparation over improvisation, of knowledge over ignorance. It was, in short, a very American victory, and it changed everything.